The studio is compelling. There's a pleasure in it, there's a sensuality in it. It's your world, it's what you've created. It's, in some ways, it's what's created who you are now. I can't disentangle myself from the work. Sometimes it's an absolute pleasure to start a painting, sometimes it's a real chore to approach the blank canvas, and sometimes it's like, well, I just really want to start doing something. I'm mixing up some a bit of acrylic glaze, a bit of dark colour. I primarily glaze most of the time, a little bit of a watercolour type of effect, but I'm using acrylic paints all the time, and I use a lot of acrylic emulsion because I like to use the gesso ground as a highlight coming through. I don't actually paint white highlights with my painting. I use, as you see in the canvases over here, the background comes through to create the highlights. It's like a watercolour effect. I'm going to pour onto this canvas right now, so I want to lay it down flat. And I'm going to just pour this quite liberally. Then I get my alternate brush, which is actually a sponge. And I get a smaller sponge. I mostly use sea sponges for these because they're really very, very soft and subtle. And then sometimes I'll come back into the painting with the thicker paint and a brush, just to get a little bit more tonality in the. When I start seeing a shape in what I've poured, this is generally how I start a lot of these paintings. I really just start quite subconsciously, and I begin at one point and then I just work out from there. And then, of course, after many sessions of sitting and looking, I start seeing more shapes and how they can relate to each other, and I'm building up clusters of shapes in a way that sort of form assemblages and piles of intriguing objects potentially, which sometimes actually start to resemble certain architectural aspects of places I've actually worked in or been to, whether they're steps along the rivers of the Ganges or whether they're porticos in Bologna. I've never wanted to be too literal with the work. It's always like, I want to suggest that there is something going on here. I like to keep it quite open, but I also still like to have that suggestion that it is coming from somewhere. It is potentially going somewhere else because it's an organic process in the studio, but it's not total abstraction.
He's playing a lot between two-dimensional and three-dimensional, how a smear of paint on the canvas, just with a bit of shading or a bit of a line, that two-dimensional thing can obtain a kind of objecthood, a kind of three-dimensionality. So in a sense, some of these bigger works, he's playing with chaos, how things form up out of chaos. It's not only the two-dimensionality becoming three-dimensionality, but how you can start to read forms more or less from nothing. So you can look at the work from two ways, as a deconstruction of the architecture, but also this forming up just through the play of the line.
Definitely the architecture is coming in as a way to sort of to pin the shapes, to locate the shapes, because that's where these objects are coming from. They're coming from not only this unconscious urge here, but initially they actually are coming from me observing humans carrying things around. They've got a whole pile of blankets, or they're picking up a painting over here. There's something about that collective assemblage of objects with the human body melding with a shape, which becomes quite abstracted for me.
Terry's always been interested in gestures and energy, the emotional energy of the gesture between people, and that kind of gets expanded to, a more universal dimension.
When I first started work with figurative work, again because I didn't want to be too literal, I started seeing arms and legs and breasts and heads as objects as opposed to human form. And so I sort of made them quite concrete like that. And then the objects have sort of moved away from the body and become isolated. And then at one point I will then go and pick that piece up and put it in a painting somewhere else. So it becomes an abstracted, but also it's come from the body, or it's come from an interaction with a bunch of objects. I've never actually really thought that art was something that I really wanted to do. I knew that that I liked drawing, that I sort of liked painting, and I actually studied graphic design and worked as a graphic designer for a number of years. I decided, well, I was doing creative work for other people, but not for myself, so I started to go back into painting again.
He's a very skilled draftsperson and drawer, and his initial practice was using scratch boards.
You have a black chalk on a white board that's been heat set, and you can scratch into it with a sharp point and you get black on white. And I started using it probably in the late 80s, I think. I could create more of a narrative somehow because I'm just using the hand and the wrist, and there's something a little bit more about storytelling in that. The graphic quality is very, very special with scraper board. I have been going back to Varanasi a number of times to produce projects. It actually set up a few different things for me. One was actually to be able to go to another country and work, which I really enjoy doing, leaving the familiar environment, but also having found something there, a particular venue, which pretty much up till now has been basically along the river's edge in Varanasi, which is just a wonderful place full of activities, both secular and religious.
Terry was doing this residency in Kriti Gallery in Varanasi, and he would go for an evening stroll along the Ghats, which are those wonderful stone steps going down to the Ganges, and he became attracted to all the people sitting contemplating. And he just began taking casual snapshots of the backs of these people because he's interested in sculptural form. And then he realised he had a kind of inverse portrait, not so much of the universal face, but the backs, became a kind of cross-cultural portrait of contemporary India.
I started taking the photographs of the backs because I wanted to take them back to the studio to paint them. But 3 days later I realised that the photographs were working totally fine as semi-abstracted, sort of iconographic sculptural pieces in themselves. When I was about some way through the project and I was so used to holding this little camera up behind the backs, I really felt like I was intruding, more so than I would have done if I was actually, it was a face to face. These backs were really just looking, staring at me quite emphatically, quite solidly saying, "I am here, why are you looking at me?" Really, they were sort of shouting it out at me. So there was the humanity in the back, of course, as well. But also just the cross-section of the clothing. In terms of portraiture, they will tell you stories about that person, whether they're lower caste, whether they're Hindu. There's a story to tell. So in that sense, there's a portrait there. I moved to Kandos about 3 years ago, though I was actually born in a country town further west of here called Coonamble. And I also started realising as I was coming out here, there was a certain amount of nostalgia about this countryside, about the riverbeds and the big gum trees. And I didn't think about it initially, but not long after I moved here did I realise that was a part of the reason why I'm here. Very strong connection to the land. My being in my studio and making friends with my paintings, there is a lot of reassurance in that. And it's not just about creating art. It's about avoiding other situations, but knowing that you have this thing that can discourage those sorts of anxieties or frustrations, and that's quite a big part for me, a big part of the dynamic of working in a studio. Quite often people are saying, well, is this animal, vegetable or mineral? And I'm saying, well, it's all of the above. And I'm really very happy that they do that they can't quite figure out what it is, which means that I'm being very successful with that morphing proposal. It's either morphing into something or morphing away from something. I'm going to take some of that off, I think, and that paint off a little bit harsh.
I would suggest that people enter his world through a cartoon sensibility. Just a little bit left of field, a little bit oblique.
That's it. It's getting better.
Just look at the play of the forms, even while it might not be obvious. It's a very intrinsic part of the work. He's never going to give you an objective representation of reality. when he's dealing with objectivity and the object, there's a lot of play on the idea of what an object is and what objectivity is. You know, the object's there, it's its own entity. Everything's manipulated, everything's created.
Yeah, I might leave that for now.